Whoa, whoa, oh. Boom. Bobby Bomb, boom, 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 Bobby Bomb. We oh yeah. Studio. We are practical revolutionaries. Cuba's is a most unique revolution, which some people maintain contradicts one of the most orthodox premises of the revolutionary movement expressed by Lenin. Without a revolutionary theory, there is no revolutionary movement. It would be suitable to say that revolutionary theory, as the expression of a social truth, surpasses any declaration of it. That is to say, even if the theory is not known, the revolution can succeed if historical reality is interpreted correctly, and if the forces involved are utilized correctly. Every revolution always incorporates elements of very different tendencies, which nevertheless coincide in action and in the revolution's most immediate objectives. It is clear that if the leaders have an adequate theoretical knowledge prior to the action, they can avoid trial and error whenever the adopted theory corresponds to the reality. The principal actors of this revolution had no coherent theoretical criteria, but it cannot be said they were ignorant of the various concepts of history, society, economics, and revolution which are being discussed in the world today. Profound knowledge of reality, the close relationship with the people, the firmness of the liberator's objective, and the practical revolutionary experience gave to those leaders the chance to form a more complete theoretical concept. The foregoing should be considered as introduction to the explication of this curious phenomenon which has intrigued the entire world, the Cuban Revolution. It is a deed worthy of study in contemporary world history, the how and the why of a group of men who, shattered by an army enormously superior in technique and equipment, first managed to survive, soon became strong, later became stronger than the enemy in battle zones, still later moved into new zones of combat, and finally defeated that enemy on the battlefield, even though their troops were still very inferior in number. Naturally, we who often do not show the requisite concern for theory will not run the risk of expounding the truth of the Cuban Revolution as though we were its masters. We will simply try to give the bases from which one can interpret this truth. In fact, the Cuban Revolution must be separated into two absolutely distinct stages. That of the armed action after January the 1st, 1959, and the political, economic and social transformation since then. Even these two stages deserve further subdivisions. However, we will not take them from the viewpoint of historical exposition, but from a viewpoint of the evolution of the revolutionary thought of its leaders through their contact with the people. Incidentally, here one must introduce a general attitude towards one of the most controversial aims of the modern world, Marxism. When asked whether or not we are Marxists, our position is the same as that of a physicist or a biologist when asked if he is a Newtonian or if he is a Pastorian. There are truths so evident, so much a part of people's knowledge, that it is now useless to discuss them. One ought to be a Marxist with the same naturalness with which one is a Newtonian in physics or Pastorian in biology. Considering that if facts determine new concepts, these new concepts will never divest themselves of that portion of truth possessed by the older concepts they have outdated. Such is the case, for example, of Einsteinian relativity or of Planck's quantum theory with respect to the discoveries of Newton. They take nothing at all away from the greatness of the learned Englishman. Thanks to Newton, physics was able to advance until it had achieved new concepts of space. The learned Englishman provided the necessary stepping stones for them. The advances in social and political science, as in other fields, belong to a long historical process whose links are connecting, adding up, moulding, and constantly perfecting themselves. In the origin of peoples, there exists a Chinese, Arab, or Hindu mathematics. Today, mathematics has no frontiers. In the course of history, there was a Greek, Pythagoras, an Italian Galileo, an English Newton, a German Gauss, a Russian Lobachevsky, and Einstein, etc. Thus, in the field of social and political science, from Democritus to Marx, a long series of thinkers added their original investigations and accumulated a body of experience and of doctrines. The merit of Marx is in suddenly producing a qualitative change in the history of social thought. He interprets history, understands its dynamics, predicts the future, but in addition to predicting it, which would satisfy his scientific obligation, he expresses a revolutionary concept. The world must not only be interpreted, it must be transformed. Man ceases to be the slave and tool of his environment and converts himself into the architect of his own destiny. At that moment, Marx puts himself in a position where he becomes the necessary target of all who have a special interest in maintaining the old. Similar to Democritus before him, whose work was burned by Plato and his disciples, the ideologues of the Athenian slave aristocracy. Beginning with the revolutionary Marx, a political group with concrete ideas establishes itself, basing itself on the giants, Marx and Engels, developing through successive steps with personalities like Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and the new Soviet Chinese rulers. It establishes a body of doctrine and, let us say, examples to follow. The Cuban Revolution takes up Marx at the point where he himself left science to shoulder his revolutionary rifle. And it takes him up at that point, not in a revisionist spirit of struggling against that which follows Marx, of reviving pure Marx, but simply because up to that point Marx, the scientist, placed himself outside of the history he studied and predicted. From then on, Marx the revolutionary could fight within history. We practical revolutionaries, initiating our own struggle, simply fulfill laws foreseen by Marx the scientist. We are simply adjusting ourselves to the predictions of the scientific Marx as we travel this road of rebellion, struggling against the old structure of power, supporting ourselves in the people of the destruction of this structure, and having the happiness of this people as the basis of our struggle. That is to say, and it is well to emphasize this once again, the laws of Marxism are present in the events of the Cuban Revolution, independently of what its leaders profess and fully know of these laws from a theoretical point of view. Those events began before the landing of the Grand Mile and continued long after, and included the landing itself, and setting up of the second guerrilla column, the third and the fourth, the invasion of the Sierra de Cristal, the establishment of the Second Front, the general strike of April and its failure, the setback of the Great Offensive, and the invasion of Las Villas. Each of those brief historical moments in the guerrilla warfare framed distinct social concepts and distinct appreciations of the Cuban reality. They outline the thought of the military leaders of the revolution, those who in time would also take their position as political leaders. Before the landing of the Grand Mile, a mentality predominated that to some degree might be called subjectivist. Blind confidence in a rapid popular explosion, enthusiasm and faith in the power to liquidate the Batista regime by a swift armed uprising, combined with the spontaneous revolutionary strikes and the subsequent fall of the dictator. The movement was the direct heir of the Orthodox Party, and its main slogan was "Shame against money." That is to say, administrative honesty as the principal concern of the new Cuban government. And yet, in history will absolve me, Fidel Castro had noted the bases which the revolution has now almost totally established, but which have also been surpassed by it, as the revolution has affected the economy more and more profoundly, and this in turn has brought about a similar deepening of the revolutionary process in the political field, with obvious national and international consequences. After the landing came the defeat and almost total destruction of the forces and their regrouping and integration as guerrillas. Characteristic of those few survivors imbued with the spirit of struggle was the understanding that to count upon spontaneous outbursts throughout the island was a deception, an illusion. They understood also that the fight would have to be a long one and that it would need vast campesino participation. At this point, the campesinos entered the guerrilla war for the first time. Two forces, hardly important in terms of the number of combatants, but of the great psychological value, were unveiled. First, the antagonism that the city people who comprised the central guerrilla group felt towards the campesino were erased. The campesinos had trusted the group and above all feared the barbarous reprisals of the government. Two facts revealed themselves at this stage, both very important for the interrelated factors. To the campesinos, the bestialities of the army and all the persecution would not be sufficient to put an end to the guerrilla war, even though the army was capable of liquidating the campesinos' homes, crops and families. To take refuge with those in hiding was a good solution. In turn, the guerrillas' fighters learned the necessity, each time more pointed, of winning over the campesino masses, which required obviously that they be offered something they desired very much. And there was nothing that the campesinos sought more than land. After that came a nomadic stage in which the rebel army kept gaining zones of influence. It could not remain in these areas for any length of time, but then neither could the enemy. As a result of a series of combats, a rather fluid front was mapped. Then, on May the 28th, 1957, in Ugaro, an attack was launched against a well-armed, well-situated garrison which had ready access to reinforcements, due to its position by the sea and its airport. The rebel victory was very costly. Some 30% of the rebel forces were killed or wounded, but it showed that the forces could sweep down from the mountain and wage successful battles in the fields, but they should come after the enemy rather than wait for it to pursue them. Shortly thereafter, the first segregation took place, and a second rebel column was organized. It went into combat immediately. The two columns attacked Estrada Palma on the 26th of July, and 5 days later, Huesito, which is 30 kilometers away. From then on, the battles were more important. We were beginning to stand firm against enemy counterattacks. We resisted all its attempts to penetrate into the Sierra, and we maintained our vast front areas. Oh, vast front areas. You've got lovely vast front areas. In the process, the guerrillas were now gaining strength from the local campesinos and some recruits from the cities. This led us to develop new columns still, and from February 1958 on, these columns began to take the overall offensive. Column number 3, led by Almeida, reached close to Santiago, while number 6, named in honor of Frank Pace, who had died a few months earlier, and led by Raul Castro, managed to cross the main highway in the first few days of March and established itself in the hills around Mayari, there creating the Second Oriental Front, Frank Pace. Our successes became known as they filtered through government censorship, and the people of Cuba began to look forward for the first time to a rebel victory. It is then that from Havana the idea of a nationwide struggle was discussed, specifically developing the idea of a general revolutionary strike. The function of the rebel army would then be mainly one of an irritating thorn or catalyst for the overall struggle. In those days, our guerrillas became increasingly more daring and successful, and it is then that the heroic legend of Camello Cienfuegos was born, as his column went into combat successfully in the lowlands of El Oriente for the first time under strict central orders. Nevertheless, the general strike was badly organized and planned, for it did not take into account the workers' own struggle, their unity, or their concept of revolutionary activity. The general call for the strike was launched over a clandestine radio, but the specific date, to be kept secret to the last minute, was to be announced by word of mouth, and this manner of communication was not capable of reaching all the people. The strike not only failed, but many valiant and dedicated revolutionary leaders were gunned down in the process. As an example of what went wrong, and someone should one day investigate this curious fact, Jules Dubois, the spokesman for the North American monopolies, knew ahead of time the day when the strike was to start. In any case, the failure of the strike made it clear that only through armed struggle could the government be toppled. It became imperative, therefore, that such a struggle be accelerated and intensified, and that it lead to the final confrontation and defeat of the government forces on the field of battle. By then, of course, we had established close bonds with the campesinos. In the liberated areas, we had established a rebel administration with civil and penal codes. We set up a judicial system, distributed foodstuffs, and levied taxes. Neighbouring zones also felt our influence, and in the next 2 months we waged 3 major offences, which caused 1,000 deaths among the enemy, completely demoralising it, which increased our strength, and from new volunteers by 600 actual fighters. It was then clear that we could not be defeated. Every path in Oriente became a sieve for enemy casualties. All counter-offensives by the enemy failed, and then Camello Cienfuegos, leading column number 2, and I in charge of column number 8, named for another hero of our revolution, Antonio Mazzio, were ordered to cross the province of Camagüey in order to establish ourselves in Las Villas, and thus cut the enemy's communication lines. This task changed the correlation of forces, as our 2 small columns, which included 80 and 140 men, crossed during a month and a half the lowlands of Camagüey. While constantly surrounded or combating an army of numbering thousands of men, we made it and went on to cut the island in half. It may seem strange, incomprehensible, and even incredible that 2 columns of such small size, without communications, without mobility, without the most elemental arms of modern warfare, could fight against well-trained and above all well-armed troops. Basic was the characteristic of each group. The more uncomfortable the guerrilla fighter is, and the more he is initiated into the rigors of nature, the more he feels himself at home. His morale is higher, his sense of security greater. At the same time, he has learned to risk his life in every circumstance that may arise, to trust it to luck like a tossed coin. In general, as a result of this kind of combat, it matters little to the individual guerrilla whether or not he survives. The enemy soldier in the Cuban example, which at present concerns us, is the junior partner of the dictator. He is the man who gets the last crumbs left by the long line of profiteers that begins in Wall Street and ends with him. He is disposed to defend his privilege, but he is disposed to defend them only in the degree that they are important to him. His salary and his pension are worth some suffering and some dangers, but they are never worth his life. If the price of maintaining them will cost it, he is better off giving them up. That is to say, withdrawing from the face of guerrilla danger. From these 2 concepts and these 2 moralities brings the difference which would cause the crises of December the 31st, 1958, Batista's downfall. Meanwhile, the superiority of the rebel army became clearly evident, as did with the arrival in Las Vegas the popularity of the 26th of July movement with everyone. The Revolutionary Directorate, the Second Front of Las Vegas, the Popular Socialist Party, and even some small guerrilla bands of the authentic organization. This was due in great part to the magnetic personality of our leader, Fidel Castro, but also to the just cause of our revolutionary line. Here ended the insurrection, but the men who arrived in Havana after 2 years of arduous struggle in the mountains and the plains of Oriente, in the lowlands of Camagüey, and in the mountains, plains and cities of Las Vegas were not the same men, ideologically, who landed on the beach of Las Coloradoras and who took part in the first phase of the struggle. Their distrust of the campesino had been converted into affection and respect for his virtues. Their total ignorance of life in the country has been converted into a knowledge of the needs of our guerrilleros. Their flirtations with statistics and with theory have been solidified by the cement which is practice. With the banner of agrarian reform, the execution of which began in the Sierra Maestra, these men confronted imperialism. They knew that the agrarian reform was the basis upon which the new Cuba must build itself. They also knew that the agrarian reform would give land to all the dispossessed, and that it would dispossess its unjust possessors, and they knew that the greatest of the unjust possessors were also influential men in the State Department or in the government of the United States of America. But they had learned to conquer difficulties with bravery, with audacity, and above all, the support of the people. They had now seen the future of liberation which awaited us on either side of our sufferings. To reach these conclusions, we travelled far and wide, and we changed a lot. As our armed struggle changed qualitatively over the course of the actual battle, so too did the social composition of the guerrillas and the ideological understanding of our leaders. This happened inevitably because each battle, each confrontation broadens, widens, and therefore changes its participants. And this is the revolutionary process to mature from each event. The campesino learns to believe in his own vigor. He gives the revolutionary army his capacity to suffer, his knowledge of the terrain, his love of the land, his hunger for the agrarian reform. The intellectual of whatever type throws in his might, beginning to mould the theoretical framework of this knowledge. The worker contributes his sense of organization, of unity. Above all, there is the rebel army, which proves to be more than just an irritating thorn, but on the contrary, contributes the most important lesson, leading the masses to experiences, and all men can get rid of their fear of torment. Never before was the concept of interaction so clear to us. We could feel with our bones how this new concept deepened and matured in us, teaching us the value of armed insurrection, the strength that any man has when with a weapon in his hand and the will to win in his heart, he confronts other men who are out to destroy him. And when we learn from the campesinos that there is no limit to the efforts, to the sacrifices that we can all make when we are fighting for the destiny of the people. Thus, we're bathed in campesino sweat, with a horizon of mountains and clouds. Beneath the radiant sun of the island, the rebel chief and his men entered Havana. A new history climbed from the winter's garden with the feet of the people.